there's always a temptation when you're doing research where there's no kind of end point. You're going down a path and saying, well, if I do this, then this might happen, and it would be great if this happened. And it is helpful to have someone just sort of sit you down and say, that's fine, but I would make sure that this is all tidied up for your DPhil.
Welcome to Season 2 of the sOOPR podcast. In these conversations, we're bringing you even more insights from successful fellows and advice from leaders from across the UK research landscape. I'm Nikhil Alawalia, and this is brought to you by the British Junior Cardiologists Association in partnership with the BHF CRC. If you like these videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments below. I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. Parag Gajendhragadkar, who's a post-CCT electrophysiology registrar in the East of England Deanery. Parag was a Wellcome Trust-funded academic clinical fellow and completed an MPhil in translational medicine and therapeutics from the University of Cambridge before undertaking his BHF clinical research training fellowship to pursue his PhD at the University of Oxford. His research focused on better understanding of the cellular mechanisms underlying arrhythmogenesis and sudden cardiac death, and he was awarded the ESC Young Investigator Award in 2019 for his work on predicting AF risk from ECG parameters. So, Parag, it's great to have you here, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Nikhil. Nice to see you.
So, to begin with, I wanted to get a better picture of your journey up until your PhD started.
Yeah, so I started off as an F1 in the East of England Deanery, having completed my time in Cambridge. I hadn't done any particular research projects during my time there, no lab work or anything particularly. I'd done a dissertation then. And then I decided fairly early on that I wanted to be a cardiologist, and sort of naively thought that, all cardiologists must do research, and in that very junior kind of way, tried to tick off things to do. So during my core medical training, I had 3 months out every year where I could do research, and as well as a taught MPhil that over the 2 years there. The taught MPhil was great. It was very practical, mainly to do with clinical trials run by the clinical pharmacology department in Addenbrooke's and the University of Cambridge, and learned a lot about applied statistics, trial design, that kind of thing. And my first research placement actually was within that department, and I helped run, analyze and recruit and do ethics and all that for a small randomized trial using lycopene as it was. And that was published and great. I then got my cardiology number, and as is often the case, life and clinical work took over. And I spent a couple of years doing gen med on calls, ST3, ST4, and at the same time trying to set up a possible PhD or a project. I struggled a little bit because I always wanted to do electrophysiology, and exactly what I wanted to do wasn't quite available locally in Cambridge. And so I ended up in sort of 2015, Googling various people, and came across Professor Barbara Cassidy, who worked on AF and molecular mechanisms here in Oxford, and basically cold called her, sent her a CV. We met. She was keen on doing something and offered me both either a project investigating big data. The UK Biobank was delivering its results at the time and opening up, or a molecular project using mouse models and that kind of thing. I had my heart set at the time on molecular biology, mainly just because I thought it'd be something different. And I really wanted that discovery side of research where you're, going down new routes and doing different things, basically, based on what you found before. So she encouraged me to apply and write a British Heart Foundation clinical research training fellowship, which for someone who hadn't really ever written one, or for that matter, really had any knowledge of techniques in basic science to any degree, was quite hard. And that took a while, but she was very supportive, but it was very much my own work. And, I spent a lot of time on that. Went to the BHF, and at a similar time in 2016 around Brexit, unfortunately, and they delayed all decisions for a little while. By this point, I was in ST7, working at Royal Papworth. And once I'd heard on the grapevine that my CRTF was going to be awarded, but it wasn't formalized. But on that basis, I'd had to take my OOP halfway through ST7, get special dispensation for all that, because obviously if I didn't take it then that was the end of it. And it lucked out really that obviously it was awarded and I could start with some funding. Prior to that, had to actually get a place at Oxford, and that involved an interview where my project was proposed to them, and obviously I was funded already, but nonetheless needed an interview with a couple of people there within the cardiovascular medicine department to check that they were happy with the supervisor as well as the project and things like that.
I mean, lots of things to touch on there. I want to get your insights on what it felt like coming into ST7 and not having come out of program yet, but still knowing you wanted to do research. What sort of backup plans did you have?
So I think basically I'd been thinking that I would be coming out of program for about 18 months, if I'm honest. And various things got in the way. Barbara became president for ESC. So it was very busy and not sort of, looking over my grant and submitting it. All of the costing work that goes into these things wasn't quite a priority. I took a bit of time to write things because it wasn't something familiar to me. So the whole process took time, and I was acutely conscious that my time was ticking away. And it was the standard conversation. Oh, you're going out of program next 6 months. No, not this 6 months. No, not this 6 months. And multiple emails. And it was an uncertain time. I'd heard that the BHF were going to, give me the grant, and there were sort of vague plans for soft money otherwise until the BHF thing came through. But nonetheless, I came out of program, committed, moved all my family to Oxford in February 2017, the whole thing with no salary or job or anything really. The OOP side, as I think most places now have really tightened up on, and going out of program in ST7 is extremely, frowned upon. And initially it was rejected, and I had to kind of apply back and say, look, I've always been academically trained, and I've got all this money from the BHF, which is going to go to waste, and you have to let me out, basically. So yeah, it was a little bit uncertain and a little bit of a leap of faith, but no, I didn't really have a backup.
Okay. And what were those conversations with your TPD like?
Yeah, it helped that I'd always been something I talked about in my ARCPs, and the TPDs were very aware of that and supportive of it. I was actually a VJCA rep at the time and was the STC, local STC chair, and for the rep for the committees and things. So I think a lot of people knew me and had discussed my plans and knew that there was an uncertainty about things that was out of my control, really. I'd submitted my CRTF back in February 2016 and was waiting, and then they just delayed it because of Brexit and so on. So there was a lot of uncertainty at the time that from the cardiology side, they were very sympathetic about. More centrally at a deanery level, I think, a lot of people had to make their case to get out to program in ST7. I think nowadays, if you had external funding, I think they probably would be still sympathetic, especially if it was something that you'd highlighted beforehand and discussed in your ARCPs. I think certainly the old days of going off on fellowship, clinical fellowships, coming back to a job for a bit to get a consultant job have long gone.
Yeah, I think that those points are really important, because there are probably a generation of registrars who have been impacted by Brexit and then COVID. And these uncertainties are something that we're just having to deal with and work around. So it's great to hear that it all worked out for you. So now I want to move on to the last point you said about having to interview at Oxford, even though you'd got your PhD, because it's surprising to hear that you've got the money and you've got the fellowship, but you aren't actually in the university. What did that involve?
So there are quite a few complexities associated with that, actually, and they're variable depending on both the university that you might be applying to, but also the department within that. And there can be quite serious financial implications as well, which I'll touch on as well. So the BHF are very generous and fund your clinical salary. I was one of the older registrars, so I had banding and non-banding in terms of my salary. So obviously they fund a banding, but they fund the basic clinical salary. The issues that I had were that the BHF do not fund college fees or university fees. So those are expected to be picked up by either the local department or the candidate themselves. And within Oxford, some departments subsidise the fee, others don't. And the department I was in didn't. So I was liable every year for £9,000-10,000 of tuition fees. The BHF itself doesn't provide a PhD. So they basically say, we're funding your work and we'll fund the consumables and the salary of the person. So the university itself, they schedule the interview, you have to apply the year before. So there is a deadline for that as well. So even before your funding's awarded, you kind of have to apply. They approve you pending your funding. So there's a lot of steps even before that, let alone starting and registering then for the DPhil and all of those kinds of things. The interview itself was all right for me. We had a couple of people from the cardiovascular medicine department. They asked me about my previous research, looked at the CV, gave me the outline, plan of the project proposed, who the supervisors were, and I think that counted for quite a lot. But equally, there have been people here who have applied with funding, not necessarily from the BHF, but nonetheless funding, who have been turned away and said, not sure this is suitable for a DPhil here at Oxford, and have ended up doing their research here, but registering for DPhils elsewhere or PhDs elsewhere at other universities. So yeah, perhaps not as straightforward in retrospect as I thought it was. But
how was Freshers Week?
Non-existent for me, given that I but yeah, you do get a free college affiliation. I think if I was younger and didn't have children, it would probably mean a bit more, and I'd kind of done the whole thing in Cambridge anyway. So but yeah, it was nice to have a college, and yeah, not much more than that though.
Good. And so you have been approved by the university. When do they next check in with you that things were going well from their perspective? Because obviously you have to deliver to your supervisor, but when does the university get involved again?
So I think that's something that actually changed over the course of my DPhil. So firstly, in the early days, it was monthly or termly rather reports. So you'd effectively get a report, like a school report from your supervisors. You'd put a self-report in as to how you were doing. They'd grade your progress, all that kind of stuff. And that would then go to your local director of graduate studies within cardiovascular medicine. And they would be your initial interface to checking in that you were happy with things and your supervisors were happy with things. The first formal interaction with the broader university came with what's in Oxford called a transfer. So when you first register as a DPhil student, you're probationary. And the idea is you spend a period of time, usually a year, getting some pilot data and checking that your project is feasible and that there aren't any major issues with it. This then culminates with what they call a transfer of status, where you give a presentation to a panel. And that panel is usually selected by the supervisors and comprises a couple of people, basically, who they feel have expertise in the area, but who are internal to Oxford.
Okay, fine. So give me an idea of who is making decisions, because it sounds like if yourself and Barbara Cassidy are signing off and the BHF's peer review are signing off on the work you're doing and designing it, who is on the other side of the panel saying this might not be enough for a PhD or that you're not on track?
So the BHF actually don't take that much of an interest in terms of on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
At least I found that anyway. They've given you the consumables, which are listed, and there's a plan of work there, but there is some flexibility within that. They're not checking in, so the project itself is slightly different to what you're doing for your DPhil. I think that was something I only realized once I kind of got into things a little bit more. So the project gives you the vague idea, and that's why they're giving you the money, but your DPhil really is much more about what is feasible and what you're going to be able to do because it's your DPhil. So it's not about sort of a project and delivering a paper necessarily. It's more about what your line of reasoning is. The decisions about transfers and things are typically made, again, by professors within the university, within cardiovascular medicine, but again, appointed or asked to be there by your supervisor. I actually found it quite useful and far less confrontational and kind of opaque than what might be thought. Most people have good experiences at their transfers, and really what the external people are trying to do is give some external perspective. And they're not experts in your narrow field, but they've seen a lot and they know what's deliverable and what's not. And sort of saying, look, I think if I were you, from what you've told me, you should focus on these areas. This is great, but I'm not sure you need it for the DPhil, and I wouldn't spend a load of time, on it, because it might be sexy and cool, but not sure you're going to necessarily get what you think you might get because of it. So they're much more thinking about it from a practical point of view, saying, yeah, the volume of work here looks like it's going to be all right for a DPhil. And that's experience, I think, more than anything else. Yeah. And you're on the right lines. You're not going off on crazy tangents and starting a whole new line of work, planning something new 2 years into your DPhil without having anything behind it.
So how did it feel when you were told something that you were obviously quite excited with, or something that you thought was sexy and cool, and you were told just shelve that, that's too much, and you have to just take the faith of other people who aren't involved in your day-to-day? I
mean, that's a whole PhD in itself, if I'm honest. The tension between what you think is going to work and the reality of things. More often than not, the supervisors are right. More often than not, but it's not always the case, and it's kind of up to you to make your case and do what you want to do to some extent. I didn't feel like they were telling you what to do. That wasn't it was advice. It really was advice. And there's always a temptation when you're doing research where there's no kind of endpoint particularly. You're sort of going down a path and saying, well, if I do this, then this might happen, and it would be great if this happened, and this kind of thing. And it is helpful to have someone just sort of sit you down and say, that's fine, but I would make sure that this is all tidied up for your DPhil. And if this all works out, that's fine. But, make sure you're focused on the core thing.
Fine. In your first year, whereabouts were you up to out of your whole DPhil or PhD? Because I imagine a lot of the work builds up over year 2 and especially year 3. So how did you know, and how did your assessors know that you were on track?
Yeah, I mean, that was it. That was certainly a concern for me. So part of what I was doing was looking at a human gene relevant for QT interval in the normal population that had never been studied, particularly because it was relatively new from genome-wide association studies. And the idea was to simply make a overexpressing mouse. And that had actually been started before me starting, and that was the idea. But for technical reasons, we didn't get a single mouse until, so I started in February until I think August, September. So there was a 6-month almost period where I had nothing of my own especially to work on. And I was doing, learning basic lab techniques and that kind of thing, but I didn't really have my project to get going with. So by the time I got the first mouse and then had to breed it and all of that stuff, I was almost a year in to the project and didn't have much to show. So concomitantly at that time, we had an idea about using big data from UK Biobank to look at certain aspects of this in huge data sets of 500,000 people, basically. And actually that kept me occupied because I learned programming to a big degree, R, SAS, various other kind of programs, and really got to grips with how that side of things worked whilst things were at a lull, shall we say, with the lab work. And as the lab work picked up and things picked up there, I'd already made a start with the big data and had some preliminary data there. So when it came to the transfer, I had a bit of both.
Okay. And so at what stage of your journey did you start thinking about your thesis and writing that up?
So I was comfortable because I'd done a lot of writing for the paper during the DPhil. Okay. So the big data side was really tied up neatly and I'd had the paper published. So I was pretty comfortable that I was going to be able to, convert that into a chapter of the thesis without too much trouble. And we had regular lab meetings during the DPhil. So a lot of the basic science stuff, I'd made figures for and things along the way. I went back to clinical in February 2020. I went back to halfway through ST7 and had another year after that to tidy up clinical stuff, basically. Obviously, March 2020, we had COVID and all changed there. We didn't have an A&E, but we had ECMO in Papworth, so there was a lot of reorganization. But nonetheless, I had a reasonable amount of free time, which I thought I'd just, bosh through the DPhil writing with. As everybody who's ever written one of these things will tell you, it just drags on and on and on and on. And then, had childcare responsibilities at home, 2 kids and the whole thing. So it took a lot longer than I thought. Things I wish I'd told myself, and, people tell you all the time, but you never do it, is start writing your thesis early, etc. So I spent the time, instead of writing in my final, 6 months, I spent that time really getting my paper published and doing key experiments. And as often the case, it all comes together right at the end. So you're left really, when you finished, with this, right, I think I've done most of everything I need to do. I should probably start writing my thesis now. And the supervisors have seen it all, and they sort of caution you heavily that when you go back to clinical, writing your thesis becomes a secondary priority, and that it shouldn't, and you should really try and write it early. And you go, no, but I'll be fine. I'll be able to manage everything as you've done beforehand. And life goes on, life gets in the way, and it is really, really, really hard and really miserable. There's no other kind of way of describing it, if I'm honest. Being in research full time, having that mindset that allows you to take time to write and think and know the subject is very different to going back into clinical, where you're concerned about, certainly for me anyway, as an electrophysiologist, my procedural skills, where I'm going to go after ST7, am I going to get a job? And then obviously COVID, I'm not going to get a fellowship abroad during COVID, but given, no one knows where they're going anyway. So what am I going to do instead? Huge amounts of uncertainties, as everyone has had during these things. So, really terrible time, basically. So you sort of plod along and do your thesis as much as you can every day, but it's just miserable.
Yeah,
there's no other ways to describe it, really.
Big warning sign in keeping with what everyone else says. So.
Everyone tells you and you ignore as well. Yeah, I mean, everyone goes through it. So yeah, you just gotta ride that train.
Okay, fine. And so after that first review at around the 1 year mark, when do you next come in touch with the university? Is it at the end, or is there one final touch point before that?
Yeah, so there's the confirmation of status, is what they call it.
Okay.
So you've transferred on to from being a probationary to being a full DPhil student. And the final stage is what they call a confirmation. So this is a talk to the department. Where everyone's welcome to come and listen, and you present everything you've done so far, and as well as the obligatory kind of slightly made up, everyone does that Gantt chart where you block everything and you go, it will take me 2 months to do this, 4 months to write, and all done in time. Again, at that point, there are supervisors, or rather examiners, who are external, I think they were appointed rather than asked within cardiovascular medicine for me. And they look through your project, ask questions in front of everybody, and meet with you after, and produce a report basically saying, yes, we think this person, A, will finish on time, and B, will have work sufficient that they will have a DPhil. And if at that point it doesn't look like you're going to finish on time, then they send recommendations of kind of warning, or we're not sure if everything is going to be done in time, and they may need extensions and things like that.
Fine. So what the final step, I guess, is your viva, right? And that happens after you've written your thesis usually.
Yeah.
And it sounds like until now, the supervisor has been picking or involved in the external assessors. Is that still the case for your viva? Yeah,
normally speaking. So they typically have internal, so certainly at Oxford, they have an internal examiner and an external assessor. The external person obviously is external to the university, and you, in conjunction with your supervisors, suggest people. They then contact them, and as long as they meet certain criteria within the university, they're representable in their field, there's no conflict of interest, all that kind of stuff. They haven't had major personal involvement in your thesis or your work particularly, then they're fine. The internal examiner, then their job is to kind of coordinate everything and send all the theses out that you've submitted, and look through and organize the viva itself. usually in a timely manner after you've submitted. You're not waiting a year basically after your submission to viva.
And then finally, graduation.
Yeah, I suspect again it'll be another anticlimax given everything that's happened. I'm just glad the thesis is submitted.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time and effort, especially if you've got family and things. It's lots of weekends where you can't do stuff, and your kids are sort of asking, "Is Daddy doing their thesis again?" And you've just got to, get it out of the way, basically.
Great. So we've gone through the whole journey from before application to graduation, and we've spoken that one of your big messages to the trainees listening or watching is to be on the ball with your thesis. But do you have any words of advice or wisdom for anyone who's perhaps not started or not even applied for a PhD in those early stages?
I think particularly in circumstances as they are now, planning early, and people always go, "Oh, these things take ages," and it is literally one thing after another that arises. I don't know how long it took for you to sort of get your things sorted, but from conception of an idea to actually doing it and being there doing things can be a couple of years without blinking an eye, really. And in the meantime, your time is ticking and you're running out of time. So if it's something you want to do, start thinking about it at kind of ST3 to ST5 level, and hope that you've got a year, 18 months to be out of program at the end of ST6, or at the latest. If you can go out earlier, it's great, because when you come back, then you have a bit of a cushion to tidy up and things. Otherwise, you're sort of a bit like me, where you're somewhat uncertain. I think don't be scared by doing things you're not familiar with, especially if you have supportive supervisors and you're confident in your own ability. A lot of people are put off and always thinking about something that they're familiar with and they can see the project lined out in front of them, and that's great. But taking a little bit of a risk in a good department with good supervisors is not necessarily a bad thing, and you never know how these journeys go. And having it all lined out beforehand may not necessarily end up that way anyway. So be creative and adventurous, and do things you want to. It's 3 years out of your life. Seems a long time, but it goes really quickly. And if you're not doing something that you enjoy, it can be really miserable.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great message to leave everyone on. Thanks again, Parag, so much
problems.
For your time. It's been really useful. Thanks very much. Join us next time on the podcast for...
There's as much opportunity for people to do research in the UK as there's anywhere else. And we have got a fantastic ecosystem to do it in. So I think we should feel very proud and privileged to be able to do things here.
I'm joined by Professor Sir Nilesh Samani, who's Professor of Cardiology at the University of Leicester and the Medical Director of the British Heart Foundation. We talk about his exciting areas for the future of cardiovascular research and the different facets of the BHF. We also compare research in the UK with the international experience.